Good afternoon and welcome to lunch and welcome to our lunchtime panel. I'm Monette Zard and I'm the program officer here for Global Human Rights. We began today with our president and vice president talking about the importance and urgency of fighting for human rights here at home. And our two panelists today have been at the forefront of that struggle for human rights at home in the US. Excuse me. It's a fight that has been waged really with these two folks here challenging US exceptionalism and promoting the idea of human rights and human rights law as a central foundation and framework for the fight for social justice in the US. That struggle for basic human rights unites activists, as we've heard, across continents and across movements in women's rights, LGBT rights, immigration, criminal justice, and those struggling for economic dignity and inclusion, to name but a few of the struggles. And the Foundation has been a proud supporter of that work for many years. I think it's going to be a fascinating and thought-provoking lunchtime discussion, and I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Ambassador Harold Koh, Wade Henderson, and our moderator, Jeffrey Toobin. I leave you in their very capable hands.
Good afternoon and welcome. Harold, you've worked in three administrations, the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration, and the Obama administration. How has the place of human rights, how has what you do as a government official been affected by the change in how human rights is perceived?
Well, I think, number one, human rights is far more central to the mission of the different agencies of the U.S. government. They don't have to fight to get the seat at the table in the way that they used to. On the other hand, the laws are, in some ways, out of date. The treaties were from the 50s. The U.S. took a long time ratifying many of them. There were different avenues by which these human rights laws became relevant. And that's why the title of this conference, Beyond Conventions, I think it's important, is that we move to an operational stage with less clear laws, NGOs, and governmental entities working together. So now on any particular issue, there's a coalition that's government, non-government, where the norms are being defined as we go along, and the venues are being defined as we go along. And you have ad hoc coalitions that come and weigh in, and on some issues they're successful, and some of them they're less so. And then every once in a while the courts get involved and can play a very helpful role. Sometimes they're not involved at all.
Treaties just matter less?
Well, I think the United States is unusual. We have a 67-vote rule in the Senate, which, as you can imagine, is extraordinarily hard to get. And I think what's happened is that the practice has become one where the United States largely moves toward compliance before ratification, while other countries move to ratification before compliance. So we're often in forums internationally with other countries who have ratified the treaties, but where their practices are not as good as ours and are being attacked for not having ratified these conventions. That's not a defense. I'm as frustrated as anybody by the fact that we are the only country, except for Somalia, that's still out of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or that we haven't ratified the CEDAW at this late stage. It's outrageous. But
Somalia's kind of busy though now, so they're probably not getting around to that anytime soon.
So I think the activity has moved less away from norm setting through ratification of treaties and more into operationalization of the norms. So, for example, the CEDAW movement, which took many of the CEDAW norms and tried to embed them in state and local law, I think was a very creative approach, which is exactly the kind of work that Wade and his colleagues have been doing over the years.
Well, Wade, you lead one of the great distinguished civil rights organizations of the country, and you changed the name from the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights to the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Yeah.
Why'd you do that?
Well, it's interesting, Jeffrey. The Leadership Conference was founded as the legislative arm of the civil rights movement. And every civil rights statute, from the first modern statute in 1957 to the most recent enactments of bills like the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act or the Fair Sentencing Act, have had the involvement of the Leadership Conference. But 2 years ago, we decided to change our name to embrace a human rights frame. And for us, it wasn't about cocktail chit-chat. I mean, it wasn't about being able to talk about what we were doing in glamorous terms. It was to reflect the fact that we needed a new set of tools that would allow us to move beyond the limitations of the U.S. Constitution in achieving the objectives that we sought to accomplish. So if you look at where civil and human rights are in the 21st century domestically, you think about 5 areas that really still require our work and involvement. One, of course, is the right to a quality education for every child. We think that's the bedrock of the rights movement. I started school when Brown versus the Board of Education was first decided. My kids started school 30 years later. And today, schools in the United States are as bad and as segregated in many ways as they were going back to the Brown's original framework. We also embraced voting rights as a tool for which we had to accomplish goals. And while we've made great progress, organizations like the Legal Defense Fund and the Lawyers Committee and MALDEF have done great work, the Asian American Justice Center, we still today are experiencing a level of voter suppression that goes beyond anything that most Americans recognize. I could do the same thing with the challenges of the criminal justice system. I need not mention, Tyrone Davis or Leon or Buck, the cases that are now pending today about the death penalty. Troy Davis was just denied by the Supreme Court a review of his case. He's scheduled to die tomorrow at 7 p.m. And so I could go on by identifying areas of our work where we've made progress, but where the progress has been limited because the Constitution, as one of our central documents, simply doesn't go far enough. And so we embraced a human rights frame because it added new tools to our arsenal that allowed us to expand our work in a more effective way and to challenge this principle of American exceptionalism, which has been a barrier to our engagement, not just around the world, but bringing human rights at home.
And talk a little bit about that. I mean, just to someone who's not in this world, what is the difference between civil rights and human rights?
Well, the difference from our perspective is that there are a certain recognized I guess, a cluster of civil and political rights, rights to vote, rights to enjoy due process of law, rights that are drawn certainly from the Bill of Rights and from the Constitution, ensuring that there is a level of equal treatment between individuals who are citizens of the United States. However, our Declaration of Independence recognized certain inalienable rights that were the rights of man, the rights of women. And those rights have not fully been reflected in the kind of civil protections that the Constitution provides. And so when you're talking now about the right to health care or the right to housing, rights that we believe are essential to the fulfillment, not just of equal opportunity in comparison of one citizen to another, but to your fulfillment as a person within the frame of the Constitution, we think that that is a cluster of human rights that every individual is entitled to, regardless of their citizenship status, as long as they are within the confines of our own country, and we try to extend those rights accordingly. So we think it's important, for example, that women be accorded not just equal protection among themselves, but a certain level of recognition that as persons, they are entitled to the protection of their bodies, decisions that they make as women about the control of their bodies. I mean, you see the attack on Planned Parenthood taking place in our country today. That is a fundamental attack on women's rights as a general matter, and go to their rights as human beings, not just within the context of the civil society.
It seems to me, to talk about this subject, we have to talk about the intense political polarization about anything relating to international organizations. You mentioned American exceptionalism, but here we are across the street from the UN during the General Assembly meeting, and the Republican Party in this country is, I think on a principled basis, deeply opposed to international organizations having any involvement in the business and government of the United States. How has that affected your work? And we'll just start with that.
Well, let's talk about Americans' exceptionalism. It means two different things. The pejorative meaning is that sometimes Americans are viewed as having a double standard, with themselves somehow able to stand on the lower rung. And if that's the case, then the United States is not a party to a treaty along with such lovely countries as North Korea, Iran, etc. On the other hand, I think everybody in the international arena knows that America exercises exceptional leadership on international human rights and international human rights fora, and it's very difficult to get something without America in the lead. And often we have a situation where the executive branch is trying to exercise that leadership, and what is being put on the table is whether our participation in that organization will or will not continue. I mean, the idea that they would cut off funding for the UN at this stage of the game is just ridiculous. It should be off the table. They don't want to have a UN without the United States in it, because frankly, that organization will not be able to function as effectively, even in service of the most narrowly defined US interests. So the idea of putting on the table constantly whether we cut off funding for the UN or whether this decision or that decision ought to affect our participation is extremely destructive. It makes us look petty to our allies, and it's not a real threat. On the other hand, it's constantly being put out there as if we have the freedom to go back to San Francisco and undo what was correctly decided there.
You know, Charles Percy, the senator, longtime senator from Illinois, died last week. His funeral is tomorrow, and he was emblematic, I think. I was reading an obituary of him where he was a Republican internationalist in the sense of someone who really was conservative in many respects, but also someone who really believed in engagement with the world, not just in a military way, but in a collaborative way in terms of international organizations. What's happened to that wing of the Republican Party? I'm serious. I mean, it's
Well, Harold, what's happening there?
I mean, I don't expect you to be a spokesman for the Republican Party, but I mean, but really, I mean.
Let me put it in these terms. I think there's been a complete misunderstanding of the term sovereignty. Sovereignty is taken as something where we protect ourselves from being invaded or intruded upon by these external forces. So guess what? That happened a long time ago. I mean, does anybody think that the price of the bond market is not being set by external forces? Does anybody think that our environment is not entirely controlled or affected by what's going on outside the country? Nevertheless, in this area, there is some notion that we can prevent their law from invading and intruding into our pristine law, as opposed to accepting the notion that the measure of our sovereignty is our capacity to affect and create standards that are worldwide. When I was being confirmed for my position, I was being battered about comparative law and why I focus so much as a professor on comparative law. And I said to the senator, I don't know what the largest company is in your state, but if the general counsel of that company did not understand the law of the countries in which that multinational enterprise was operating, that would be malpractice. And I'm being confirmed to be the general counsel of the State Department, and you think I shouldn't know that law? That would be malpractice.
Yes.
But there is this sort of notion that someone who wants to engage that law in an intelligent way is going to be surrendering our sovereignty as opposed to projecting our sovereignty in the only way that you can do it in a truly interconnected world.
Go ahead.
Julian Bond once referred to the Taliban wing of the Republican Party as having sort of taken control. I won't go that far, but I will say, Harold's 67-vote standard for the ratification of treaties, for example, certainly gives you an illustration of the problem. And let me give you a concrete example. October 16th, 1995. Was the Million Man March in Washington. 1 million African Americans on the Mall, African American men, an incredible day. At the same time, the House of Representatives voted on a bill to overturn a recommendation of the U.S. Federal Sentencing Commission that would have changed the crack powder cocaine laws from their 100-to-1 disparity to a 1-to-1 disparity. The Clinton administration supported the Republican bill to overturn the law. Now, I was highly critical of President Clinton at the time, but upon reflection, I recognized that he was really afraid that the Republicans were going to demonize the Democrats for being soft on crime. And he felt at the time that he had no choice. It took us an additional 15 years to get back to the point where the Sentencing Commission would make a similar recommendation. Last year, the Fair Sentencing Act reduced that disparity from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. It's not acceptable. The drugs are pharmacologically the same. It should be a 1-to-1 ratio. But we did change the law, and it's affected thousands of people. That was made possible because we had the involvement of Republicans who were not involved in 1995. People like Jeff Sessions, the senator from Alabama, was the individual who, along with Dick Durbin, helped to cut the deal. We cut the deal in the House with John Boehner as the Speaker of the House, and it could only happen because the votes were structured in a way that did not require recorded votes from either party, and we did it by voice vote.
It's such an admirable way to run a Congress.
Guys, it is, but let me say this. My job is to be effective. My job is to make change, and I can only do it if I have both Democrats and Republicans on many of the important issues of the day, so you have to find a way around that. Obviously, the Tea Party and the emergence of the Tea Party as a political force has further distorted the debate on significant policy issues of the day. So what you find now is that national interest is suborned to partisan interest, which too often controls the way in which politics are debated in Washington.
But isn't there's something paradoxical about this moment, that at a time when certainly the business community and in a different way, the academics, the NGOs, are talking more and more about the interconnectedness of the world. And certainly, if you're the CEO of Procter & Gamble or Comcast, you are going to be very concerned about your international connections. Absolutely. At the same time, there has been a certainly growing, I don't know how ultimately powerful it is, isolationist movement in the country.
Well, you and I went to a university where when they give you your law degree, they say those wise restraints that make us free. International law frees you. I mean, just imagine compared to when we were children, you get on a plane where your baggage is protected by the Warsaw Convention. You can withdraw money from an ATM machine when we used to have to change traveler's checks. Your passport in Europe on a Schengen visa takes you anywhere. You don't have to waste time negotiating your entry into various places. It's been extraordinarily liberating. And I think that's the message that hasn't really gotten out, that the network of legal rules, like the network of communications, has freed us. Now, there are dangers and costs to that, and you have to deal with that on the other side. But again, the notion that our sovereignty has been surrendered as opposed to expanded by this network. And the more that we're ignorant about it, the less we can engage it. Yeah. I'll tell you, the Chinese have a strategy toward international law that's much more integrated than is that of the United States. And that's partly because they are fully accepting of the notion that they're going to have to try to affect this system to make it work in their national interest.
Let me give you an example, though, of the importance of the non-governmental organizational community in helping to advance these goals that we've talked about. Our friend Gay McDougall, who's sitting here as a special rapporteur at the UN, in July of 2000, headed an organization called Global Rights. Gay sponsored a trip to Geneva on behalf of African American organizations to raise the injustices inherent in the criminal justice movement, area of our law. We haven't talked about it today other than to touch on the death penalty, but there are many areas that are replete with racial bias and discrimination. This effort in Geneva was called a call to action Julian Bond, Mary Berry, the great professor at UPenn, and myself and others presented an effort before the Human Rights Council at the time to talk about the injustices in the criminal justice movement. The idea was both to raise the issue internationally, but also to embarrass the United States for, on the one hand, preaching their principles of fairness and justice, and on the other, practicing areas of discrimination and being tolerant of it. And while that effort in and of itself did not change the law, it did help lay a foundation that helped to bring about the change I alluded to last year. Without NGOs pushing those who are in the administration, no matter how friendly, no matter how much we love them. When you look at the State Department today, Secretary Clinton has built a dream team of activists who were drawn from a variety of NGOs. And yet our job as NGOs is to still push the administration beyond where they're prepared to go in most instances, because that's the only way the change occurs. So what we have now recognized is that unless we have a grassroots movement that is reflective of the kinds of changes that we saw with the NAACP and many organizations in the 20th century, pushing our own administration to do more than they're prepared to do, we're not going to be effective. And that's what I think it takes today to help move the needle around international law.
Let me turn to a subject that we haven't touched on yet, but certainly is, really at the crossroads of civil rights and human rights, and certainly a big political topic in our country, which is immigration.
Yeah.
And we have a series of states that have passed new restrictive laws. Arizona, some of them will be challenged in American courts. But what is the place of the human rights movement in what is perceived by many in the United States as a solely domestic and even state matter? Is there a way to inject human rights into that conversation or into the procedures of it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think immigration policy issues are really one of the most challenging issues facing the country today. I want to give a tip of the hat to Eric Holder for having filed suit both in Arizona and in Alabama, and is obviously taking a look at this potential Supreme Court challenge next year when Arizona seeks to go before the court. But at the same time, I recognize he's also struggling with policies that were left over from the previous administration. One of them seemed to give license to states to step into an area where the United States had previously declared exclusive jurisdiction, to suggest that somehow it's okay for states like Alabama to outdo states like Arizona in passing harsh laws that challenge the fundamental notions that we have of being a democratic society and being fair to those who come to our shores. I think that our own government has to do several things to turn that around. There was a particular policy memo that was adopted by the Ashcroft administration that needs to be overturned, and we're pressing the Attorney General to do that. But we're also saying that beyond what you've done, more is needed to engage the courts in state courts, rather in states that have adopted these laws, and to push back. And then the advocacy community has a particularly important role to play. Janet Murguia, who heads the National Council of La Raza, for example, organized a boycott of the All-Star Game in Arizona, of which the Asian American Justice Center and the Leadership Conference joined in that effort. It ultimately was so successful that we were able to actually withdraw the boycott because we prevented other harsh laws from being adopted, even though they were on the table. Groups like the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, Tom Sainz, their president, is here, have helped to bring the cases that have forced the federal government to take note of what is being done and to actually get ahead of that column to try to provide leadership, because they would be embarrassed by their failure to adhere to policies that they've lifted up. I think immigration issues are challenging. I do think we have a potential break, which is to recognize not that our country is a land of immigrants and we're being honoring our tradition, although that is true. It is a recognition that the demographic change which is taking place in the U.S. today, to a degree, is inexorable. And if we are to continue to maintain our global leadership role, we're going to have to provide a quality education for every job. We're going to have to recognize that if we fail to really bring those who are here, the least among us, into the society that we lift up, the ultimate harm harm will befall the country as a whole.
Before we go to questions from the audience, let me just ask you, Harold, as a State Department official, how does purely domestic actions on immigration, like what Arizona did and other states, how does that affect the work of the State Department?
You asked me at the beginning the difference between, say, the Reagan administration and now. The Reagan administration came in really when federal power and human rights and civil rights advancement were considered to be one and the same. And at the end of the Carter administration, when the international human rights movement was becoming connected to our domestic law. And one of the big moves of the Reagan administration was to put forward the 10th Amendment, state sovereignty, et cetera. Now, can you just imagine if when American citizens go to foreign countries, they get different sets of rights in different states of Mexico or India or China, and then say that they're not subject to these treaties. But we encounter these all the time. So in the Arizona litigation, the State Department has an affidavit by our Deputy Secretary supporting it on the grounds of its disruption of foreign policy. Or, for example, the execution of Mexicans who didn't get their rights under the Vienna Convention, with some members of the state government in Texas saying, we're not a party to that treaty, which they are because of the Supremacy Clause. So I think that
Texas is currently part of the United States. that is.
And the question really, Jeff, is when Texans go overseas and are imprisoned and can't get access to their consular officials because that state is invoking the precedent that they helped to create, it's too late.
Let's go to some questions. Are there folks with microphones around? Okay, why don't you stand up and say your name, and please give a brief question and not a speech.
John Payton, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I guess I want to have a question that follows up on something Harold alluded to. For business interests, in fact, we have surrendered a huge amount of sovereignty through the WTO and other things. And I hear the point about, gee, the Republicans, but the Republicans are in favor of the WTO. And that has not caused any disruption, and it's not in our civic dialogue about we are strong enough to let the WTO make really fundamental decisions that govern how our businesses operate in the rest of the world. Race and gender and social and economic issues turn out to have much more poison associated in our domestic discussion. But the context has to be what we were very comfortable with doing for our business community at the height of our economic powers, and we ought to have the same confidence in bringing human rights into our domestic discussions and into our domestic law, just like we were very confident with the WTO and WIPO and all sorts of other things that happen quite seamlessly now. And I think that's how this discussion has to be broadened so that people can see it's not an exceptionalism point, it's actually how we deal with some of our continuing social issues.
Go ahead, Harold.
Harold?
The anti-internationalism argument has really gotten a life of its own that's now unconnected from American interests. The clearest example that we work on now is the Law of the Sea Treaty, which has been around since 1982. Every major country is a power. And now we are quite literally in a position where the Arctic, as you know, the ice cap is receding. Russia, who is a party, has most of the ports on the Arctic and would like to use that position for strategic advantage. China in the South China Sea is aggressively invoking the Law of the Sea Treaty, and our capacity to engage either on sort of a classic battle between superpowers cannot happen because we will not ratify these treaties and enter into these regimes. Business interests favor it, military interests favor it, the Joint Chiefs entirely favor it. And there is just a group of people who have enough authority or capacity to block even consideration of the treaty, or much less the ability to get 67 votes. So you now have things in which there's an overwhelming majority view that it would be a good thing to do, but that you literally cannot get it to the floor or even out of committee.
But John, I think the principle of rational self-interest dictating how our country addresses some of the issues that you've raised is still a controlling principle. When you think about policies of equal opportunity, equal employment, it is virtually unthinkable for a company with global offices around the world to engage in racial discrimination of the kind that a generation ago routinely happened in countries here. It's simply because we have made such a principle unacceptable. That principle has now been extended in many ways to the LGBT community, regardless of the fact that this country has not yet adopted the Employment Non-Discrimination Act to prevent discrimination against the LGBT community. It is an emphasis on the principle that it is in the interest of the country to engage in certain kinds of activity, and it affects their bottom line. And to the extent that we as an NGO community can help emphasize that, making it more difficult for companies to engage in the kinds of biases that we find abhorrent, I think we do ourselves a tremendous service. I point out that Don't Ask, Don't Tell officially ended as a policy of our Army today. This is the day that it came to an end. And it's a wonderful development, and certainly the LGBT community deserves much credit for having lifted the issue up to a national concern. But without the broad support of the human rights community writ large, it would never have happened. That same principle now has to be extended to the rights of indigenous peoples. It has to be extended to persons with disabilities. It has to be extended to women. So even though we salute, for example, the fact that Congress overturned a Supreme Court decision that perpetuated bias against women in the workplace, the fact that we haven't ratified CEDAW continues to hold us up to ridicule with countries around the world. I think Harold's earlier formulation, which is to say that we insist on adopting policies before we ratify conventions, in contrast to some foreign countries, is true, but that still does not absolve us of the need to move forward. And that's why I thought what Secretary Clinton and Milan Verveer did yesterday in signing a resolution recognizing that CEDAW was an inherent part of the world regime was a very important statement, even if, as a country, we have not yet ratified the convention.
Jeff, if I could say something about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Justice Brandeis, many years ago, described states as experimental laboratories. Now the experimental laboratories for testing these rights issues are other countries in the world and what has become a parallel human rights universe, which is the European human rights system. So when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell issue came up, we had a gathering with some European colleagues and counterparts, and I brought some friends from a 5-sided building in Washington. And they were very concerned about the operational implications of eliminating Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I asked each of our counterparts to get up and talk about their country's experience with gays in the military. And the first one, the German guy, got up and he said, well, we first admitted German soldiers, openly gay soldiers in 1969. Then he said by 1971, people were sort of used to it. And in fact, I think our colleagues were in a state of shock. They had no clue. This had been ratified and confirmed by the European Court of Human Rights in a series of decisions. And then finally one person said, well, what about the idea of unit cohesion? That if gay soldiers and straight soldiers are serving next to each other, it will disrupt the operational command. Isn't that a concern of yours? And the German counterpart said, well, actually, in NATO forces, openly gay German soldiers have been serving alongside of American soldiers for the last 40 years. He said, we haven't noticed any lack of unit cohesion. So this is actually an empirical test that negates this argument, or at least casts it into doubt. Now, after an extensive study, the same conclusions have been reached. But I think it shows that this comparative experience can be highly educational in testing the needs for these policies.
Want to go back there to someone? Is there someone?
Hi, my name is John Powell with the Kirwan Institute. And Wade, you suggested that one of the reasons to switch from civil rights to human rights was the idea that human rights protect all humans, while civil rights only protect citizens. And there's a big movement in the country, sort of underscored by Samuel Huntington's book, Who Are We? And in that book, for those of you who haven't read it, he argues that we're not a country of immigrants. We're a settler country, and anyone who comes after the settlers have to adhere to the same rules and norms of the settlers. And we were settled, according to Huntington, by Protestant, Christians, Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking folks. And a lot of people don't adhere to those norms. And he said we should be comfortable telling them to leave. And this is part of the mantra that's coming out of the Tea Party. And what we're seeing as we test this is that the number of people who are considered humans is actually shrinking. And so the idea that...
Everybody in this room, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And
Not
so
to mention all of Queens.
So one of the issues...
Those are my people.
I know, that's what I mean.
So I think moving to a human rights frame actually just doesn't actually address that issue. And I guess I'd like both of you to comment about this sort of, actually there's an uptick with Obama in the White House, again, about narrowing the circle. And we can test this empirically to show that more and more people, blacks in urban cities, gays, people who are homeless, immigrants, are literally falling outside of the human circle of human concern, and thereby making it virtually impossible to pass any policy to support them. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Let me say, John, it's an interesting frame. I would, though, suggest that at the end of the day, it is unlikely to control the future debate. First of all, there is a certain truth to the principle that demographics are destiny. And we are seeing demographic change in this country that is bringing about a complete wholesale democratization, small d, of the way we operate and the diversity that our country has espoused as a principle, a general principle, is being made real by the demographic change that we are seeing. I prefer to think that our politics ultimately will be shaped by this concept of rational self-interest. I think that the U.S. ultimately likes its position in the world, both of leadership and the economic position that we hold, and we're going to want to retain that. And I have seen companies that, in theory, should be really reflecting the views that you suggested, that are embracing more diverse principles of leadership and change, because they recognize that in the world in which we live, that is ultimately a key to advancing the goals that we share in common. Now, it's not to say that there won't be rough edges. There's certainly going to be rough edges between the majority and many ethnic communities. There are rough edges within the ethnic communities themselves. I mean, I'm struggling with a concern involving the Cherokee Nation that has expelled a group of African American descendants, denying them the right of citizenship in the Cherokee Nation, even though there are treaties that would presumably cover that issue. But questions of sovereignty of indigenous people never come into question with respect to what we do, because we believe that that's a principle that has to be upheld. And so we struggle to try to find a way to address that. Now, we do that as we also struggle to provide quality public education, deal with this issue of, criminal justice, fairness, et cetera. All I'm suggesting is that many of the issues that we struggled with in the 20th century are still with us in the 21st century, but our ability to have broad impact in bringing about change, I think, has been enhanced, and I don't think that narrow view is likely to be controlling.
I mean, just if I can add, when Justice O'Connor wrote the opinion in the Groder case in 2003, upholding the affirmative action plan at the University of Michigan Law School, the two things she found most persuasive were the arguments by the Fortune 500 companies who submitted a brief saying, look, we are competing in an international business community. We need a diverse workforce. And the other was the American military, or 18 retired leaders, including Norman Schwarzkopf and people like that, who said, look, we need a diverse officer corps. So I think the point of, you can make arguments based on morality, but there are also very self-interested traditional American reasons to support civil rights as well. Anyway, we are just about out of time. Harold, we're going to give you the last word.
Well, human rights are the force that is the bulwark against politics. Most majoritarian views don't like certain people, and the way to make sure those people don't get anything is to objectify them and make them not human beings. And whether it's detainees on Guantanamo or defendants on death row or people who are different, the best way to guarantee that those individuals are going to be denied basic rights of individuality and equality is to objectify them, call them something other than human beings, say that the places that they are law-free zones where they're human beings without human rights. And it's the insistence of this movement that if you are a human being, born human, you cannot be deprived of those rights, no matter how despised you are, no matter what things you've done, is a bulwark against petty politics, majoritarianism, a political process that can be broken. And it's one that has been backed by a government, an entirely non-governmental process, which is reflected by those here. And that I think has been the power of this movement. And it's a power that is felt within this country, which has so many powerful forces on the other side.
Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Job.